Seattle House Mafia.
All right, welcome to another episode of Seattle House Mafia Industry Interviews. Today's guest has been a fixture in the Pacific Northwest music scene for over 2 decades. He started in live sound at the ripe age of 12, was spinning vinyl by 14, and held down multiple DJ residencies from 2010 to 2020. He ran a successful club in Olympia for nearly a decade, worked major festivals and key production roles, and launched his own event company in 2021. In 2022, Insomniac brought him on as their regional promoter for the Pacific Northwest. He's basically done it all, from performing to running full-scale events, and he's here to talk about it. Welcome, Alex. Do I say Bosi? Is that pronouncing it right? Welcome, Alex Bosi. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming through. I know you have a busy schedule, so it's awesome to have you here.
It's all right. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so I think let's jump right into the Insomniac stuff, because I think that's, not that your life's not interesting. We're going to talk about that in a second, but I do want to, like, at a high level, maybe just give a. This is not a quiz. Just a brief definition of who Insomniac is, what they do, kind of what that looks like.
Totally. Insomniac Events, if you're not familiar, we are one of the leaders in, global dance music festivals and large scale events. I say large scale, but actually we do very small ones too. We produce, I don't actually know what the full number is now. We've been launching so many, but well over 400, 500 events a year between all the clubs and festivals. Primarily focused on dance music, although we do dabble in hip hop and rock in a few markets and with some festival brands. And we started really kind of looking at the Pacific Northwest after the pandemic. And, there was obviously some opening there to come in and do some events and festival style things. And so it's been a really fun road so far, and we're happy to be in the market.
Nice. How big, just as a company in general, how big is Insomniac?
It's very large. It's definitely not a corporation, but it has a lot of the shared organizational elements. There's a legal team and a marketing team and all these different things where, I've come from my own productions and many others where you're wearing, every hat, and there's a small team of 3 people that, comprise the whole company. And so, there's pros and cons to being such a large entity. You can do a lot of really cool things, and you have the, bandwidth and power to make the impossible happen. You look at EDC Vegas and the scope of that type of event, but it can also kind of bite you on the back end with some of the really little cool experiential things where, because we are such a big organization, getting everything through approvals and the different steps needed to make that happen. There's a lot more steps than, say, a local, regional promoter, someone that's, from the city that they're promoting in. And so it's definitely a double-edged sword. Yeah. But, it's been a very good experience so far, and very happy to be where I'm at, and, very privileged. So,
I mean, even like, I would imagine even like graphics, flyers, advertise. It's funny. We didn't talk about this off camera, but I was just reading an article how Deborah DeLuca dropped off a festival lineup because her name wasn't big enough, but they were doing more of an artsy like flyer thing, but she was in like lower font. Mm-hmm. And I mean, just that kind of detail that you guys have to be on top of. And I would imagine that's why those approvals are important. And, you're working with management and all that other stuff.
Yeah, all of the artist requests and needs there, are its own discussions, to the Deborah DeLuca, thing is a great example where, there is a lot of different back and forth that we have to negotiate. And that's not just with one artist, but all of the artists on these lineups. And then also, just making sure that, we have a brand reputation. We have a certain level that people expect in production or talent from our events, operational, even things like, not taking 30 minutes to get into the venue, having efficient lines and all of those things. And so, that's the biggest thing too, with putting a lot of this together is obviously you have all of the, the artist fonts and the lineup stuff, but also just making sure that, we're embodying Insomniac as a brand, making sure that we're giving the audience, a good experience, making sure that all the nooks and crannies, are taken care of, and that we can really, do the show safely, efficiency, and create a memorable experience for everyone to, go home and then, really want to come to our next one.
Yeah, I mean, and you can say it about any of this stuff, because I know you guys probably have things you can't share publicly, but I would love to hear just like a brief history of where Insomniac started, because I don't know if people know that. I mean, I've read a little bit about it, but I'd love to just get a little background.
As many people know, Pasquale Rotella is still the CEO of the company. He still approves every flyer that goes out the door and is very involved in the day-to-day operations. He started as a promoter in the mid-90s in LA. Literally, he himself standing on the corner and passing out flyers, and doing Renegades at the time. As obviously the rave culture was very underground, and embodied that. And then over the years, as his company grow, obviously the industry has changed and become more mainstream, and a lot more venues and markets are now open to hosting those types of events, where previously they were a little bit more closed off. And so he's done a phenomenal job just really steering the company. And you can really, when you talk to him, or if you're involved even in meetings, you really see that his vision is still embodied in what we do, and he very much still has a part of it. Although we are such a large company, and there are so many people involved in the process of the creation to the final product of an event, his taste and style is still very, very prominent, and he's been able to maintain that, which is very difficult to do when you scale to be the size that Insomniac is now. So,
I was gonna say that. I mean, I've worked in my other life, I've worked in big corporations, big technology companies, and even with some startups, but inevitably at some point, the leadership, the founders, they end up either on the board or stepping down and bringing in different. And it's so cool to hear that he's still making core decisions for the company, which is that's like a special thing that doesn't really happen that much.
It really doesn't, and it really does speak to, I think, obviously the authenticity of the company, but also his vision, that, still getting his vision to be what the brand embodies, and going through all of the checks and balances and all of the other people and creatives, shows that he really does have that knack to come up with an idea that is, worth pursuing and, completing until the end and seeing through. And so it's great. It's been a wonderful opportunity to work with them for the last few years. We're very professional. They're very hospitable. I definitely don't have any gripes or any complaints in all the overall process. And it's really phenomenal to see what he's been able to do for the company. Obviously attend events like EDC, or look at some of the events that we do globally now. We do EDCs in multiple countries. Most recently, we just announced going to Colombia and Medellin. Is that true? That's so cool. Last year we did EDC Thailand in Phuket for the first time, and so it's really amazing to see, the scale of the company, what we're able to produce, but also, again, just the brand authenticity to his original vision. Even down to the little things like our merchandise, and again, like the graphic and like flyer direction, he still is very involved in all of those aspects. And I know my schedule is hectic, but I can't even imagine what his calendar looks like, but he finds time.
Do you end up getting to go to like the EDC and like Phuket, or do you get those opportunities?
It's definitely always on the table. And again, there's good business and bad business.
Sure.
It's sometimes I get to go for fun. Sometimes if there's a business case, again, to use EDC Vegas as kind of the main example. Typically for people, at least in my role, that handle talent or, the higher end operations of the events, we're usually always in attendance there, just because, similar to Miami Music Week, it's such a melting pot of industry professionals and, a lot of European people and agents that don't make it over to the US consistently. So you actually are able to get a lot of face time, with some of the people that you're stuck just being on email or maybe Zoom with throughout the year. And so it's a great networking, and just for everybody to get in the room and kind of talk off the record of our visions for different artists or new brand concepts and, the like. And it's a really nice experience for everyone. But
so again, this is where you can decline answering the question, but like, I know you guys technically do concerts, you do festivals, you do raves. Is there like one part of the business I would make an assumption about festivals. It's the biggest part of the business, but is that like, what is the biggest part of the business now, and is it going to continue that way, as far as you see it?
Festivals, by and far, the largest portion of our business. As far as them losing that crown, I don't see that happening anytime soon. But the concert portion of our business has grown exponentially over the last few years. I think that directly correlates with electronic music becoming more and more popular in the more mainstream, like top 40, top 100 demographics that weren't necessarily drawn to electronic music when it was more underground, or that haven't been following the genre and that are more of new consumers to that. You're seeing the popularity. Honestly, video games has been a huge push. If you look at the video game soundtracks for the last handful of years, you'll find predominantly electronic sounds.
Yeah.
So a lot of the newer, the Gen Zs and everything else, they grew up listening to drum and bass while they were playing Forza or, all of these things. And so it's become much more a part of people's culture. That they digest, daily, versus where it was 10 or 20 years ago, which, was much more of an underground. Obviously, that comes with good and bad things. But yeah, I think, the festival market is still very, very strong. If you look at, I think, people, if they have to choose between going to a couple concerts or club shows versus saving up and going to a larger festival, we usually see that they'll choose to put their money toward a festival just because of the overall experience and the immersiveness there. But yeah, a lot of artists are really being successful doing their own concert tours that, you would see people like Metallica or, hip hop artists like Kendrick, or anybody else doing these large arena tours. And now that's actually an avenue that a lot of these, at least the larger artists in electronic music can take and are seeing success.
Yeah.
Even new venues abroad, you look at the new club culture in Ibiza with Universe just recently opening, and some of these very large format, venues that are just being completely filled, by these artists. And so it's really exciting to see.
Yeah.
But also, concerning is the wrong word, but you want to make sure that it doesn't lose its authenticity. The people that are getting introduced to electronic music or consuming it for the first time, that they do at least have a glimpse of the heritage and the history behind it, of where these sounds originated or came from, or, the arc that some of these artists, have gone playing to 2 people or 50 people, and then now they're playing to 200,000 people. And so there's a lot of really cool stories in the industry, but deviating from the question, but definitely festivals, bread and butter for sure. We own a lot of venues as well, nightclubs, private venues for corporate events.
So Insomniac actually owns real estate. Okay.
Yeah, we're very multifaceted. We have our own merch company. We have our own fabrication for like decor and site experience. We have our own trucking company. We own multiple venues. We have obviously Insomniac Records, and all of its subsidiaries that go through. We just launched a new Insomniac radio app. It's constantly evolving, and again, the benefit of having so many creatives under the roof is there's always someone reaching into a area that we haven't explored yet, or staying in touch with some of the new trends and things that we're seeing. So
I would imagine that's probably where some of the general, we're talking again off camera about sort of online scrutiny and stuff, but the general scrutiny comes from being such a large company. Can you really have a soul? Can you really be true to the underground? Can you really represent, the right talent and a region and all that stuff? I'm sure you guys battle with that all the time, right? Or at least that perception. We
definitely do.
Yeah.
And I think that goes into their strategy of hiring certain people. Take myself, for example. I'm the only Insomniac employee, besides some people that we contract locally, that's actually a permanent full-time employee for the company in the Pacific Northwest.
Got it. So this is your region.
This is my region. I oversee pretty much all of the intricacies of everything that goes on here, from festivals to small shows to government and business relations, farming for new venue locations, talent, you name it. luckily I have a pretty broad background, and so I'm able to do that. They call me a Swiss Army knife in the meetings as like a nickname, but it's, they wanted someone that was from this market and that had a certain, length of experience and, heritage, pedigree, whatever term you want to use, where, I understand what Seattle looked like 20 years ago. I understand what it looks like now. Do I know everything? Absolutely not. And I have a bunch of local allies that I rely on consistently to keep me in the know on things. But they do care enough to actually go out of their way to hire someone and put an established person in this market versus just trying to remotely do everything from, LA, or step in and be like, oh, we're just going to plant this here and it's going to work. They do actually care about each individual market has its own representation, whether it be internal to Insomniac or if they're partnering with an outside promoter or a third party. They definitely want that brand authenticity, but also they want to be able to recognize what the market wants, what it needs, and its own unique history to make sure that we're, honoring that, but also blending in, and having some consistency with what the market is used to. So
I think there's some assumptions. So corporate office is Southern California, right?
Yes. Yeah, primarily based in Calabasas.
Yep.
It's a really cool building. Wish I could go down there more.
Yeah,
I got a really, really nice recording studio and everything else. It's a fun complex. But so it's, I work, all of my counterparts are mainly based in Los Angeles.
Right.
So I kind of direct and work with all of our subsequent teams. The different festivals have their own teams. Our concerts have teams. We have all of these different, kind of silos.
Right.
And so I bridge across all of them and the production side to offer, insight from the Northwest perspective.
Yeah.
So
is there a bunch of are there, because I know you guys do stuff in Las Vegas, I know you're doing stuff in the Rockies, is there people like you, are there Alexes kind of sprinkled throughout the US?
There are.
Okay.
Yeah, and to my, what I was saying before, either someone like myself that's fully employed, by Insomniac, or at least a, established regional promoter representative that we partner with. Las Vegas, we do a lot of our own events, but we also work with Regulation. We, work with different, people in each market. You mentioned Denver. We are, just recently kind of getting into Denver as well as Arizona. And that, consistently we're not looking to stop. We're always looking for new opportunities. But I think, to your point too, with us being sometimes looked at as the big, machine,
California guys coming in and taking over our local. Yeah.
And that's what I really wanted to hit the brakes on immediately from, again, I'm lucky to be from this area. I moved, actually born and raised here, but, lived in the Seattle metro area really since I was 10. And it's been really nice to kind of segue Insomniac in and to honor the traditions or some of the, people that have been prominent in this market, and that was the biggest thing going in. I've reached out to even some of the other local promoters and I'm like, hey, we're not trying to snuff you out. I have actually chosen not to go into specific venues to not push anybody out of the fold or, be that kind of muscle through, I want us to be cohesive. Obviously we are running a business, and like anybody else, we're always looking to win and, sell out each show, but I'm not looking to do that at the expense of the other local promoters. We're not trying to shut anybody down or eat anybody up. And, I think that's a big common misconception, especially with, we haven't really touched on this, but, we do have a relationship with Live Nation. And although we still get to run the entire front end of our company, and we do events that are not affiliated with Live Nation, take Day Trip, for example, that's an Insomniac event. You look at Beyond Wonderland at the Gorge, and that is Insomniac and Live Nation, mostly because Live Nation owns and operates the Gorge.
Okay.
And so, it's very valuable to have such a large company like Live Nation in our corner, because we can utilize some of their resources globally to help, make our events happen. And obviously they've done time and time again for every genre across the board, between venues to, booking shows and being a promoter, concert tours. So it's a real valuable tool to have in the toolbox, but also great because we're not chained to fully being kind of under that umbrella. We're still very, again, Pasquale's able to be involved in all these decisions.
Sure.
It's not like we're just being ran by a corporation behind the scenes
Right.
and having Insomniac. So, a lot of people will see that in our connection with Live Nation and assume that, they're just corporate,
They're here to suck up all the
exactly,
dollars and kill
they don't
us
care
all.
about the locals, they
Yeah.
don't care about the markets, and that's exactly what, I want to really turn around in people's heads when I meet them. Like, hey, I'm here to work with you. I want to do cool stuff, and
the fact that you're local, you grew up here. If you were here 20 years ago, you were here during the rave heyday, and you were part of that. You were DJing the venues, right? Like, we probably were at the same parties, even though this is the first time we met. We were at the same parties in the same rooms. Maybe one of us was DJing. Who knows, right? Like, that's pretty smart, and I think that's good that we get that out there. That, like, there's local representation in these markets, and you're thinking about the community and the region, and growing that versus taking it over from some California,
Absolutely. And you think about my, again, back to running a business, obviously other promoters are technically my competitors, but there's some that I look at as a competitor, and then there's some that I look at as, just someone else enriching the scene.
Yeah.
And so obviously there's certain people that I wouldn't work with, but there's a lot that I would love to, just to have that local scene. And one of the big things that I'm trying to, we touched on a little bit before we got on camera, but what can be a difficult thing because of the size of our organization, but something that I really want to focus on in the coming, kind of year and 2 years is really micronizing some of our events and doing really fun, 200-person pop-ups or 300-person this, where we're not necessarily trying to throw a festival or make a bunch of money or do anything, but it's just cool immersive experiences. It can, keep our brand present and in tune with the market and our audiences. It gives, people, again, using sometimes the leverage of our network or reputation, that we can open some doors that normally are closed to certain venues or, with certain, government or municipal people, where we have the pedigree that we can, make them comfortable with allowing us to do these things, because they know that we'll go through the necessary extra steps to make sure that it's regulated and safe. And so, it's, it's something that I really want to focus on, is more of just the localized community events.
And I'd imagine at the same time tapping some of the local artists, right? Like,
absolutely
making them part of the, they don't, at least on support, right? Which is very cool.
Yeah, I love giving, as a local DJ myself for so many years, I understand, the upward hill climb that it can be to even get a response from certain people, let alone, and to be honest, it wears on me with the amount of notifications I get and the amount of people, but I always try to really respond. I try not to leave people on red. I want people to feel that they can be connected to us, and that, me being the person in the market, I'm really wearing that hat, and I'm kind of the face of Insomniac. And although that's a huge, privilege and responsibility that I carry, I want to make sure that we're still reaching out to all of these, people that are local. If I see comments on some of our events of people that had bad experiences or something, like, I'll happily reach out to those people in DMs, to try to remedy that, because, that's the last thing that we want. And it'd be very difficult, when you have these events that are tens of thousands of people, to make sure that everyone's having a, positive, equal experience across the board. But it's something that we definitely do pay attention to, and we want to make sure that people are enjoying, and again, not just slapping our name on stuff and, trying, we're doing a nationwide concert tour, here you go, you get what you get. We really want to make sure that we're doing it the correct way and resonating with people.
No, I think that mindfulness is, the bigger you get, the more magnified even one person having a bad experience probably gets, right? I would. I was gonna say, I'll tell you offline sometime about some of the stuff we deal with in my real world job when it comes to customer satisfaction. I won't bore everybody here, but I think one question, like something, I know we've talked probably about a lot of things that people don't realize that you guys have to do to make an event pop, but like, what's something that you think in your mind people don't understand, that details around logistics or really anything, just because I think it's a much bigger endeavor to throw a festival or even an event than a lot of people understand. And I say this coming from a DJ's perspective, where really like knowing people in the community and being involved in the scene for so long, the DJing part's easy, right? Like getting books hard, but there's so many logistics on the front end for folks like you and Insomniac to make shit happen. Like, what do people not know? What do they need to understand?
I think, and it comes with throwing events is, you are the face. But, a lot of the things that are often looked at as maybe, us trying to take security processes and entry as an example.
Yeah.
We're not trying to make that more difficult. We're not trying to make that more timely. We're not trying to prevent people from getting into venues or cause frustrations. But, a lot of that comes down to ultimately, it's whatever venue we are utilizing's call on their level of that. And if that meets or exceeds our own level, then we'll roll with theirs. If it is below our level, then we'll rise up to our standards. But there's a lot of logistics of, why can't you just open up 3 more entrances or this? Right. And it's, it's unfortunately not that easy. I mean, I would love to be able to just take a fire hose and, point it at all these things because they annoy us too.
Right.
But, there's a lot of logistical constraints, whether it's, with police, fire, safety, and overall like crowd control and making sure that people are safe.
Yep. And
that, everybody is there and there's no malicious people in the crowd, but also just, with booking our talent, being Insomniac, we throw some amazing events that have, hundreds of thousands of attendees. And I think there's an expectation that a lot of people have where, if we're doing an event at the Gorge, for example, they expect a certain amount of headliners and lineup. And it's increasingly difficult as costs rise exorbitantly across the board, from talent to production to even insurance and, all of these types of things that we're limited, unfortunately, in Washington by the sheer kind of size of the market and the venues available. You look at the Gorge for Beyond Wonderland. We also do a Beyond Wonderland in Southern California. And actually this last weekend, we just did one in Chicago. Our California one, for example, is able to sell 3 times the amount of tickets for that venue than our event at the Gorge. But people in their minds, and rightfully so, will correlate, well, why does our lineup look like this? The SoCal lineup is this big. And it's strictly down to the financials of, we don't have enough tickets to sell to be able to support that kind of a talent.
Got it.
And then also you're seeing some of the shift in the industry, like I mentioned, where a lot more artists, especially the, higher tiered artists, are wanting to still play festivals, but they're also wanting to do their own concert tours and arenas. And so in a market like Seattle, that does not have as broad of a demographic and population as in LA or Chicago and New York, it's much more difficult for us to say have an artist do a Tacoma Dome 2 nights, and okay, we're going to do 10 to 20,000 tickets to this guy. Well, that kind of takes that artist out of our market for at least half a year to a year, because that audience is not necessarily going to come out again in force for that. And so there's a lot of booking strategies that I don't think people look at for making sure that everything's sustainable, everybody's happy, ticket prices are where they need to be, the production's to a certain level, and all of those variables are constantly in flux, whether it's be pricing or product availability or artist availability. And so you're constantly just we refer to it it's like playing chess on top of a house of cards.
Right.
You have to understand the chess game and all of the other players that are in it, and other promoters that are all looking to book the same talent or do festivals. But then also you're doing it on this foundation that could be an artist cancellation, it could be cancel, them messing up and getting canceled. It could be a venue, having an incident and then not being available anymore. There's a million different bullet points that could happen. And so it's like this constantly in flux scenario where nothing's really certain. And it's always like up to the day of the show where you're like, oh, hopefully the lights turn on and hopefully the vendor shows up at the stage and
hopefully the flights
doesn't get delayed.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And now, not as much now, but oh man, there was a stretch, in the last year that flights were just
And SeaTac sucks. Like,
you know, they do what they can. You know, I feel the same way. Anybody that's lived here with like our road construction, it's like, you know, it's always been my whole life. I-5's been under construction, and it's like they finally complete something, but unfortunately, it's taken so long that now we're still 5 years behind.
Totally.
You know, because the population has grown or anything else, and so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's so much I could go into, but I think from an audience perspective, you know, it's. People, rightfully so, just don't think that way.
Right.
You know, they're not wired to think of all the bits and pieces and logistics that go into actually making that event happen. You know, they want to buy their ticket and show up and have a good time.
Have a great time.
As they should. You know, and that's why I have a job, you know, to allow them to have that simplicity and enjoyment. And, you know, it is unfortunate sometimes where, you know, I try not to take it personally, but, you know, people do have a bad experience. And, you know, you're like, oh, man, you know, we try so hard to do this. Or, you know, maybe it's something that you're like, oh, if I could just explain it and they would understand. Right. But instead, you know, they're just ripping us to shreds, you know, over this. And, you know, it's like that in everywhere. But you just kind of take a gulp and move on. You know?
You guys are big enough where you guys probably do like event postmortems where you're sitting down in a war room and you're just like, yeah, this was good, this sucked. We're not going to do this again. You know, this artist is questionable now. Point, right.
You know, or you know, maybe they just, you know, it's a very fun job, but it's a job. You know, it's either way you're showing up and getting paid. You got to clock in at some point. And there's some people that, you know, back to everything always being in flux, that's always shifting, you know, and people's palate for artists or new genres. You know, it's constantly, you know, we're having to be on the cutting edge of everything.
I was going to ask you about that because there's like, you know, and some of the other folks we've talked to too, there's got to be this balance of there's a sort of nostalgia with some of these big names, but there's also like up and comers that are blowing up and so quickly, especially with social media and TikTok and all this stuff. Like when it comes to those decisions regionally, is that all on you, or do you get fed suggestions, or like how does that work? You know, choosing artists for certain. If we break it down into the Pacific Northwest, which is your realm, right?
Yep. It's honestly a mixed bag. Very much an open floor discussion. Okay. In regards to everyone that, you know, my coworkers and counterparts, but also from the artist and agency management standpoint. You know, we all have our new up-and-comers that we're fans of, or that we're seeing like, oh, you know, this person I didn't even know sold out this club last weekend. And, you know, you get turned on to new music through so many different avenues. And it's really, you know, the same across the board. No matter what anybody's job, title, or role, you know, everyone is being exposed to new music, digesting it, creating their own opinion. And then, you know, I meet with our talent team, you know, honestly daily, but in, you know, multiple times a week in more of a structured meeting where we focus primarily on the Seattle market. And we go through big lists of established artists, new up and comers, you know, what we think they would, you know, do in the market, if they would fit onto a festival property, if we should go for a club show or a concert, you know, and then we kind of just identify using any means necessary of information, you know, that we can glean from past plays or, you know, social media stats, views. You know, it's a whole different ballgame now with social media and the internet. You know, you have, I don't know if you ever heard of Vengeant.
No.
So wild guy, produces drum and bass from the UK, but he uses like found sounds. So he'll go record a bus backfiring and turn this into just this
or
filthy
like a drip from a
or you know, a chainsaw. It could be anything, a baby crying, you know, and he just turns into this filthy drum and bass.
I know
track.
who you're talking about now. Actually, I know exactly who. Okay,
and most people don't know who he is.
Right.
He recently played the Crocodile. I think probably a month ago or so. I don't know. My time goes like this. I got there a little late because I didn't know he was playing so early. Played at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. I walked in the door to the back of the Crocodile and like immediately ran into people.
Okay,
it was packed to the wall. People are crowd surfing, and I'm like, it's 9 p.m. on a Tuesday.
That's crazy.
And like, you know, half my friends have never even heard of this guy. But that's another thing where it's like that social media presence.
He got YouTube famous, right? That's where I think I've seen him. The first stuff he
YouTube,
did was,
Instagram, TikTok,
I've
and
watched
it's like
a bunch of his videos.
Now, you know, that's really equating into ticket sales. You know, and again, it's every new platform that comes out. You know, it's this whole new jump that we have to get up to speed with and monitor. But it's awesome now with the power of the internet because so many talented people not just in electronic music, but in any industry,
Right.
you know, went unknown and undiscovered for how many decades, you know, before the internet proliferated to it. And granted, there's a lot of bad things that come with it too. You know, we don't even need to start on that, you know, rabbit hole. But yeah, it's like now you can really get discovered, you know, and you have the ability to put yourself in front of, you know, the powers that be that can get you a booking, or that can, you know, fly you across the pond into North America, you know, and it's something that would never really existed before. And it became, you know, it always used to be, you know, I didn't work in it to the scope that I did now, but, you know, I think very much like a popularity, more like kind of the good old boys club where, oh, my friend's this really good DJ, you should book him. And now, obviously that still happens, but, you know, there's so much exposure now to new talent.
Yeah.
But, you know, you can open your phone and go to a website that you've never been to before and find 5 new artists, you know, in rock and roll or EDM or any other kind of thing, and be like, these guys are sick, you know, and they're from Milwaukee or, you know, Antwerp, you know, it doesn't matter, but you're still able to, you know, get in tune and digest them. I love SoundCloud now because, you know, the algorithm will just take me down this road where, you know, I'll find these tracks and I'm like, oh, this guy has to be popular. And they'll be like, oh, he has 8 fans, you know, but I love it because it's like, dude, these underground producers and they're killing it, you know, and I never would have found this 10 years ago. So
yeah, I know. I mean, back when we were coming up, I mean, I think you're a little younger than me, but, you know, different regions, there was a DC sound, and there was, you know, and then you break it down by genres within DC or Baltimore or, you know, Detroit or whatever.
You know,
exactly. So it is interesting how flattened out everything has gotten. The other thing I want to point out, and this was very apparent to me when we just met. As soon as you walked in the door, I was like, okay, cool. He's a music lover. He's not just some guy pretending to be a music lover. I mean, your background as a DJ, owning a venue, like, you get it. And I think that's, I mean, they kind of scored with you hiring you, because that's an element that you can't really pound into somebody, you know, a music lover or not, right? And I'm sure you've worked with people who aren't music lovers. They're money lovers and they're business lovers and they're, you know, clout lovers, but they don't necessarily love the music, right?
Yeah, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't really talked too much about, you know, kind of where my humble beginnings, but that was even at a young, you know, my parents weren't musical. They were, you know, they loved music and had it on, but it's not like, you know, my dad was some concert pianist or something, you know, where I grew up in this pedigree.
Totally.
You know, standard middle class American family, Seattle area. And, you know, by the time I was 6, I was just collecting tapes, CDs, anything I could go to. You know, my mom used to take me to Goodwill when I was a kid and didn't have very much money. You know, I'd buy all these records for 25 cents, you know, anything I could find. And that's originally, I was at a young age, like 10 or 12, you know, 13 years old. And I was involved in a bunch of like local youth programs at the time, like think kind of like Boys and Girls Club, you know, like different weekday activities, you know, people do after school. And they approached me and were like, hey, you know, you have more CDs and music than anyone else here. Would you mind playing music, you know, and like kind of DJing? And I literally started on 2 single, like JVC tray loaded home CD players and a Mackie mixer. And I would just kind of volume fade, you know, I'd fast forward like, oh, that's a guitar riff. And I could, you know, I started wiring my brain at a young age to be like, oh, if I play the track 30 seconds in, when it dips and the other one goes, and it'll, you know. And then that got into, you know, vinyl and exploring actually like, well, I can manipulate the BPM. This is amazing, you know. And I got into digital DJing too. I was always kind of a tech nerd and, you know, a computer person when I was young. And so some of the early programs like Final Scratch and Tractor, Virtual DJ, Virtual DJ 3. I mean, I cut my teeth with a lot of stuff. And I would start.
Did you have one of those original Final Scratch Dome?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I still have actually some Final Scratch, the control vinyl, sitting in my. I'm like, I got to keep those just for nostalgia.
You got to, yeah.
And I got to a point where I was doing it hybridly. You know, this is before controllers really existed. Right. But I'd be like, oh, okay, well, I have all my records and I love those, but you know, I'm a kid, so I can't go spend $500 a week on fresh vinyl platinum, and I can't, you know, do this. So it gave me an opportunity where I can just run my laptop into channel 3 and I'll play vinyl, and then I can play a couple of these digital songs that I find, and then I can go back to vinyl. And that just led down a whole rabbit hole of, you know, kind of hybrid technology. I always was very interested in guys. I don't know if you're familiar with like Ian Golden.
Yeah.
And the DJ Tech Tools back in the
DJ
day.
Tech Tool. I used to watch all his videos, man.
Yeah, and now obviously with the industry and the way it's gone, pretty much play just on Flash now.
I have chroma cables all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, I got their USB, the new dual drives they just put out.
Shout out DJ Tech Tools.
Yeah, for years though, I would play with a tractor setup. Yep. And ideally on turntables if they had it in the club. And then I would always use a machine and a pad controller that I had mapped just
nice
all over the place. And, I used to do a lot of open format, as I mentioned before. And so hip hop and scratching and cue juggles and, a lot of like a Red Bull 3 style environment. Yeah. And that's how I played for years and years because I was always in front of a different audience. Yep. And, I was in open format clubs and, it was like there's no putting a set together or it's not like a festival slot where you're the headline, you can do whatever you want. It's like whatever hand you get dealt at 10 p.m.
and
on a Friday,
bachelorette party shows up
exactly. But I honestly loved that. I had such a broad taste for music, and that's when I started DJing actively. I got my turntables and started doing vinyl when I was 14, and I used to play in bands and was very involved in like live sound and used to be a roadie wherever I could. And I would seek out house parties like when I was in high school and anywhere I could, just truck out Coffin and speakers and always play for free and, try to cram. I loved electronic music among everything, but I would always try to cram electronic music down everyone's throat before it was popular. And so I'd find all these remixes and edits that I could, or with my vinyl, I'd, rip the acapella.
Right.
And then, I'd just be at this house party playing house music or breaks with hip hop vocals over the top or, rock samples, and I'd be like kind of tricking people like, what can I get away with until they get mad and come and start holding their phone in my face or like writing a piece of paper in those days, actually.
But in those days,
exactly. Play something I can dance to.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, I don't know. Music has always been a huge passion of mine. And even when I'm too old to throw events, and I'll still be listening and digesting it. And
yeah, I don't think that you can just quit it. Unfortunately, like that's like I was telling you, I've been on this like vinyl tear recently, and I play with my CDJs, especially if I have a gig coming up, but I'd much rather be on my turntables playing vinyl. It's just I absolutely love it, and it's so meditative for me and so calming, and like it's just always fun to have people come in here who are obvious music lovers too, and very similar background, playing an open format and just at the mercy of whatever crowd comes. Now I had some great gigs where I didn't have to do that, but like
same.
But those open format gigs are character builders, man.
But it teaches your chops.
Oh yeah.
And that was the thing is, I loved it because I could show up to a party and like, I don't care who's here. I got something in the bag for everybody. Yeah. And I got really good at doing creative transitions with effects or, breaking or different kinds of turntable tricks, and like, okay, I got to transition out of this hip hop song into a classic rock track from the 80s, and then I want to go back to house music. How can I make all this work? When it's like 70 BPM, 140, 80, it's all over the map. And so, yeah, it's a
workout.
It's fun. And I'm a challenge addict. Like I'm always been very fortunate that I've always had a lot of like inner drive, and I'm always reaching for the next rung on the ladder. And so, back to even the technology implementation when I was getting started, I was always looking for that edge of like, I can mix two records together, but what about a third, or what about a drum pad, or and it's really, now it's almost technology has left me behind, where it's so advanced now with all the flips and remixes and stems. I would have been in heaven back then, but now I'm like, oh man, I'm just overwhelmed.
But yeah, I hear you. But at the same, what I've learned is like, you can't really buy that 20, 30 years of experience with the music. No matter what, like there are some brilliant kids that are coming up, and like we're talking about this new talent, but there is an element of being able to call back on that 30 years of house parties and vinyl, and it brings some value. It's nuanced, but it's hard to sort of quantify it. But like you see some brilliant even house DJs now that are in their 50s, but they just bring a level of depth that it's you don't necessarily see it with the younger kids, even though everybody's playing on the same CDJs, right? There's something going on with Carrie Chandler that's not necessarily happening with, New Kid on the Block, right?
Completely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think that, back to the pros and cons of technology, the thing I miss most about vinyl and that era is that everyone had not only pride, but a very unique record collection. Obviously you have your radio and day in, day out Club Warriors that have, 2 of every hip hop record that's popular, etc. But, I remember getting home from the record store and just being so excited to go spin with my friends because I'm like, no one has these 5 records that I just bought and they're going to kill it, and there was that excitement over singular tracks that I don't feel is as prominent anymore. Everybody, and again, you can separate, the men from the boys kind of thing of everyone has a shared music library now. Anybody can go on Beatport, anybody can go on SoundCloud. Obviously you can still dig and there's digital digging and, the nuances of that art that have transitioned into technology, but man, I remember buying white labels and buying 2 or 3 because I'm like, nah, no one else is going to have these.
I know,
and I got the only ones. I'll give them to the people I really like.
3? Okay, I'll just take them.
And
Paul Song was talking about the same thing. And once he played it first, he would maybe give out a copy if somebody was really complimentary.
Totally.
Yeah, totally. Same thing.
And that was, and there was a lot of pride to that.
Yeah.
And DJing wasn't easy.
No.
And obviously it didn't pay a ton. So, I mean, the veteran DJs that were really grinding it out, it's like, all right, man, you really respect the culture, you're really passionate about music, whatever's driving that person. And now with, controllerism and technology and the, proliferation of the internet and how everything is readily available, it's so easy for anyone to get into the industry, which again, I think has brought forth so many new artists that maybe would not have crossed that barrier previously, but also it kind of dilutes a lot of the if everyone's playing the same song, how many times do you go to a festival and you hear, the last 3 artists all play, a handful of the same tracks?
Yeah.
Well, it'd be cool if people were just a little bit more experimental. I don't know what the right word would be, but conscious maybe of, not playing everything commercial. Obviously there's an environment for that, but throwing in and having a veteran DJ there that has that deep music library and repertoire, but also that has been the DJ for 30 years.
Yeah.
There's a seasoning to that of reading a room.
There is.
And knowing when to play the right track, when to pull out that old disco record and throw it on, for even if the people, half of them in the room were alive when the track came out, but knowing that that's going to create an energy at the right moment for that people or the people in the audience and have that resonate effect with them. And it's just something you can't teach. You can tell what every button is. I can tell you do this to do a baby scratch, do the crossfader here. You can instruct every aspect of it except for that just mental ability of the experience of knowing what works, knowing when you're not working and how to change and get your audience back. Or anybody that's played in clubs, you want to I want to clear the dance for a little bit because they got to buy drinks and they got to use the restroom. And, that's part of it. You want to drive them off,
Turning the room over. Yep.
But all those nuances, that you were mentioning too, I think it's just a little bit of a lost art in that regard. And everyone expects to be on a festival stage overnight. I have so many local DJs, that they'll be playing for less than 6 months, and they'll shoot me a DM about, hey, I want to play on Boo. And I'm like, I'd love to get you on Boo, but, let's get you some training wheels, man, chops, and also just try to honor a little bit of the, hierarchy of, there's some other DJs that have been playing for 10 years that are waiting for their first booking on Boo or to play at the Gorge for the first time, and they lived here for 15 years. And so it's a balance of weighing out, the old versus the new artists, especially in a local time, because everyone feels obviously that they should be there or they have that entitlement, which isn't always wrong or right. But it's, it's bridging that gap and also knowing how to approach them without offending people, or you don't want to stifle their creativity or shut them down to a point where this isn't worth my time, I'm going to give up, because they could be the next Dom Dalla or Green Velvet or and so it's a lot of politics. A lot of politics.
and you're that's I was gonna get to that because you're in sort of this regional role where you have And I think entitlement's the perfect word. You have these young kids coming up. I've been doing this for 6 months. I played like 14 house parties, and I actually played one club and one open turntable night, and you can't get me in. I rocked it, And then you have on the other side of that, which you have guys my age who have been, playing music for 30 years now, and they're like, well, I used to do this and this and this, and I should, like I said, the DJing's the easy part, right? Like, and expecting to get booked. It's this industry, as you know, has such a short memory, right? Like
incredibly.
I mean, it's great. You played 30 years ago and you had big nights and you were doing that, but like, what are you doing now? And what can you offer? And I think at some point it does come down to like, maybe support is not so much a big deal around ticket sales, but it does come down to like, are you still marketable? And,
relevancy.
Yeah, it's got to be relevant, right?
And I mean, take me, for example. We talked a little bit beforehand, but, that was one of kind of the main things that has caused me not to be as much of an active DJ anymore. Obviously my bandwidth is being consumed by a ton of other things now, which is part of the reason, but it was the rat race of the social media and having to have, TikTok content and all of this stuff. And I'm a very real, authentic person. I try to be honest. I try to be a person of my word. And like, to me, I am not, this is outgoing for me. I'm not a spotlight seeker. That was never, I never wanted to be an MTV star when I started DJing. It was all just because of my musical passion and sharing that with people. And it was fun. And, it got to a point now where there's so much marketing work needed to maintain relevancy as an artist, or to like get bigger bookings or better fees, or, build that mantle for yourself, that I was like, I'm good. I can do this. I've done it for so many years. I'm not trying to pay my mortgage with it.
Right.
And, it's losing some of the things that made it so appealing and that I loved about it.
Yeah.
And so I've really stepped back a lot from, DJing out actively, although I still love it. And, catch me at a house party randomly all over the place, or, something like this. But it's, I'll give that to the new generations. And, I'm not trying to, I'll play some of our parties now and then, but full transparency is usually my colleagues like pushing me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like, you gotta play. And I'm like, oh no, I'm busy, I'm doing this other stuff. No, you gotta play it. So I'm like, fine.
That's funny.
I'll come out.
Have you ever had to step in, like when somebody didn't show up, like one of your, I would imagine.
Not in my Insomniac role.
Okay.
But over the years, there's been 3 occasions, 2 of which were at the Gorge.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
And I was in a production role, or like a stage manager, or something of that sort. And it was guys. And, at the time I was actively DJing. So it was like, oh, please be late. This is great. And, I remember once it was at the Gorge. It was one of the Paradisos back in the day. I was a stage manager and I was on the bass stage. And we got word that this guy, whoever's playing next, I won't name, but was not going to make it. And so the artist that was following their slot was already there. And I knocked on the green room and I was like, hey, do you want to play longer? And they gave me this like pushback of like, why the hell would I want to do that? And I looked at him, I'm like, what are you talking about? There's 30,000 people in front of you that like love you. Why wouldn't you want to do this? Right. And I was like, well, fine, if you're not going to play, I'm going to play. And he was like, oh, you're going to play? And I was like, yeah, I am.
Nice.
And I hopped right back up on the stage. Within 10 minutes, that guy was out of his dressing room because he didn't know that I had been a DJ for so long. And so like, and he comes up all pissed off and elbows me out of the way, like, I'll play it now. And I'm like, it was just, I hate people that just have that kind of attitude.
Right.
I'm like, just be a nice person.
Yeah, be a nice person.
You can still say no, but
yeah, who does? I mean,
all the ego trip and that's a whole other side of the industry that we could talk for 4 hours.
I could imagine, right? Like, I'm sure you've run, especially with the size of shows and the size of acts that you brought on board, and you don't necessarily need to name names, but I imagine you got some definite like ego rider tantrum stories, right?
Just
some juicy
stuff. And just a lot of diva stuff.
I imagine
there was I'll say again, I won't name names, but there was at way back in the day at the Showbox, we had a very notable like old school artist that still plays in the scene today. And the way that they have the showbox set up with their sound is, they do a lot of live music there. So they have the subs configured in a way that the stage is actually pretty quiet to eliminate feedback issues or anything, with instruments. And so he had this big intro planned, and it was like, okay, headline. And so start the intro, and he comes out, and it drops, and he starts getting visibly very frustrated and angry, and like starts like kind of looking at me and looking at his tour manager, and he just walks off the stage. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, the show's started, like what's going? Everything's working, like what is going on? And he goes over, and he's like, oh, the speaker, he used some different choice language, but he's like, the speakers aren't on, and we're all like, no, man, like it's going, like you just botched your whole intro, and there's dead air now. And it's because they didn't have the booth super loud. Whoever started the intro and stuff for him to come on, and it's just like, oh man,
it's probably great in the house, right? And,
it was. I mean, again, everything was rolling full steam, and so just like little moments like that, where we're like, come on, man, like don't be such a. And it's also, there's so many that you go into expecting like, oh man, this guy's gonna put me through the ringer, for in the advancing process, or at the show, like, and like take Tiesto for example, like super cool dude.
I've heard that several times.
Super cool dude,
super cool guy.
And not to out him or anything, I don't think so, but like still to this day usually requests a pair of DJ decks and also speakers in his green room that are connected to the front of house, because he actively wants to hear what the DJs before him are playing. Literally he's the only artist that I've come across that has made that request. Though. And I was like, sweet dude, like you'll actually take tracks out of your set, or change your set around based on who's whether it's local support or other festival act, doesn't matter who it is. And I'm like, that's really cool, that you're still that in tune and care about your presentation and what you're doing, that you want to make sure that you're not, replaying a bunch of songs, or you're not completely changing the energy of a room. Right.
Like there's some continuity in the vibe, or if he needs to change it up because it's not working, right? Like,
totally.
That's really cool. Yeah.
And he's someone, obviously, Mr. Club Culture, right? That I would go into expecting like this guy could be either really cool or it could be really, really much, an a-hole and like demanding and stuff. And it's always a pleasant surprise when, you run into someone of that caliber that's like super chill and down to earth and is having fun still, and playing live to a point, because so many people now it's just rinse and repeat on things. And it's cool to encounter that, but there's definitely a lot of moments where it's the opposite, where you're like, oh man, when's this guy off the stage? I'm not bugging him again.
I know, I can imagine. Well, and then I was actually wondering about like, so we talked a lot about the actual talent, but what about the audience? Has the audience changed since you've been doing this stuff? Like, it seems like my guess would be it has, but like, what has been a big fundamental change, say from your old school days to now? Audience, obviously the phones, right? Like that's.
Yes. So, everyone is, recording all the phones out. You see, and that's been going on for years. You know, you look at like the no signal parties, and, there's lots of different variations of the no cell phone events. Right. And I think pros and cons to that, because, back to the social media aspect, maybe they're recording a local opener that's killing it and is going to be getting some recognition for this online, or, right. So there's a balance of, but then also, if you have an act like, Eric Prydz or something that comes up and, they have their hollow, but the music itself is trying to cater to more of an underground, put your phone away experience. And then, you have that kind of taint, or even photos or video recaps of the event, it's just the sea of phone screens, when it's taken from the back. And it's ebb and flow. I mean, that obviously, technology as a whole is vastly different. Right. And the way that people consume things, but also just club culture. Yeah. I mean, it's probably the biggest, in my growing up, everybody went to the bar or the club every Friday and Saturday, because also to meet people and to get that social engagement, because social media wasn't around in the level that it is now. And, you can't just hop on Zoom and video chat with your friend for an hour and feel like you're getting that kind of interaction. Right. People had to actually go out to be social. And so, the club culture, especially post-pandemic, people missed a few years of being able to do that. Not as much of an impact for people like us, but, all of your fresh 18 to 21-year-olds that really missed out on that introductory experience to nightclubs or music venues and, nightlife as a whole. And so, you're seeing the way that people, I don't know if consume's the right word, but the way that they're consuming music in a live manner is very different. And obviously back to the costs of everything, cost of living, along with all the stuff that goes into a festival, everything's getting more and more expensive. So you're seeing people go out less frequently. They're also spending less money on things like alcohol or other things that have traditionally been big revenue drivers in the industry. And they're saving their money in their pocket. So, instead of going to a Seattle nightclub, every Friday and Saturday, they're maybe going to one smaller club show or like a showbox or a victory hall. And then they're really saving their money for, Beyond Wonderland or for, that big concert at Tacoma Dome or something else that they really want to, put all their eggs into that basket. And I think that that's great too. Yeah. I don't think there's a wrong or a right to that, but it's just a very different audience now than it was before. Everybody's also very in tune with a lot more like the details and things involving the event, because they have that platform of online where everyone can discuss it during the event or post-event. You look at a lot of the Facebook and online groups, where people will just go through, what did you think of this? And there'll be 400 comments, and it's great because we can identify any shortcomings that we had, but also, it gives a platform to people to really dissect, and validate or invalidate certain artists or event companies or venues. And so, that was also never a big thing, previously. It was, people come, they go to the club and they leave, whether you had a good time or not. And then no one really says anything about it. Maybe they don't come back next weekend, but now it's this open platform of discussion.
That's interesting. I didn't think about
which
that.
Broods a lot of positivity and change, but also can create a very negative mindset because there's a lot of people that are set out to, for one reason or another, attack other people or to tear them down. And again, a lot of that's can be done very positively, but also there's a flip side to it. And so all of those concepts, I think, are the biggest differentiator that I see in nightlife from when I was actively DJing or, when I was 21 and 18 and going out to my first, bar shows and stuff like that, that nowadays that culture has just changed drastically. In that regard.
Do you guys actually at Insomniac, do you have people that are combing through like social feeds just to see if there's like some pattern recognition happening so you guys can course correct if needed or enhance something that's already getting positive? That's pretty
absolutely cool. In real time for anything substantial. There's stuff that will happen sometimes at an event that I won't even be aware of, but our social media team will text me and be like, hey, people are saying that the line at the entrance is around the block, when it had been running fine the whole time. Right. And so I'm not thinking to run out there and check it, but then it'll raise awareness on even our operational side of like, hey, what's going on? And then you find out, the metal detector's lost power or something that, didn't get through the chain while everything else is going on. And so there's a lot of benefit to that too, where we have people literally, and they'll be like, hey, everyone's commenting, the water tastes bad out of this fountain or stuff, that you wouldn't normally think of. Right. And so it's great to identify, kind of those things and flag it. But, again, also can be done the opposite way. And there's it's impossible to do in police, but, there's no validity to any of these comments, right? Like you don't know, you could post tomorrow that the sky's red, and it's up to whoever's reading that to discern if that's true or not. And so a lot of these things, again, it depends really on the intent of the commenter or the originator of that post or video, on what they're trying to achieve. Are they trying to be positive? Are they trying to be negative? And, now again, in the attention grabbing society that we are in and all the social media, a lot of that gets made into more than it is or, dramified to create bigger scenarios. And so there's a lot of discernment that has to go in and kind of back and research and a lot of those comments and a lot of claims and, and obviously the artists deal with it, the venues deal with it, we deal with it as a promoter. So we definitely have teams that go through, during the event, post-event, compile everything. Data is key in any industry.
For sure.
For understanding your audience. And I think that that's at the end of the day, at least myself, I'm trying to create experiences that people enjoy and that they want. That was the biggest thing when I was running venues or even when I was a DJ, hiring like open format DJs for a venue that people go to for the venue and the environment, not necessarily for the artist that's playing, not to take any steam out of their, ability or, prominence, but, like, oh, I'm going to go to this venue because I want to be in that atmosphere. Yeah. And I used to tell people that I was like, back to the hand you get dealt thing, they want to hear the latest Katy Perry track 3 times and there's your whole dance floor that wants to hear that, then play it, like give the people what they want to do. Create an environment. It's not about me. I can go home and listen to whatever I want. I can go home and play whatever records I want. Obviously, I want to be an artist and expose people to new music that I think they would like as both a promoter and when I was a DJ. But also, you can't make it about your own... I listen to so many... I have to listen to every genre now.
Yeah.
Some I love. Some I've grown to love. Right. And there's still some that I want to smack my face against the wall.
Dubstep. No, I'm just teasing.
Well, but everybody has different...
I know.
I mean, and so, being inclusive of all of the communities and trying to really remove myself from the equation.
Yeah.
Obviously, I get joy out of booking stuff that I really like because then I get to go and experience it right along with everybody else. But, there's a lot of genres that you have to really look at that maybe aren't your forte. But I've also developed taste that I maybe never would have had.
Definitely.
Or found those gems in that stack of, tracks that I'm going through where I'm like, oh, wow, this is really good. Or, this and that. And so it's turned me on to, music that I never would have listened to previously or explored. So, I think back to the brand authenticity thing too, just really trying to, I'm not booking Seattle nightlife for Alex Bosi. I'm booking it for Seattle.
Right.
And if in 2 months, all they want to hear is, break beats and drum and bass, and they don't want house or techno or anything else, and cool, I'll book that because we cater to the people.
Yeah.
They define who we are. They keep us in business. They keep us relevant. And, at the end of the day, there's, Insomniac for a reason has always been like, you are the headliner. It's not the artist. It's the concert goer. It's every ticket holder is a headliner. They're the people that we're trying to impress. They're the people that we're trying to foster and give them a fun, safe experience that they can, tell their friends about and, bring their mom and dad to,
right.
Get married at. There's so many different facets of the industry and festival culture that have developed over the years. And so, it's about the people.
Yeah.
It's about the music. It's about the lights. It's about the environment. But ultimately, it's about the people. And we try our best to be unbiased and, do that. And, again, I can speak only for myself in that regard. But that's something that, really has stuck with me just over my years in the industry of, you don't have to be a jukebox, but be receptive to your audience, and don't be in this mindset of, I'm going to do it my way and I'm going to do it this, I was like, no. There's always somebody out there that has a different idea. Right. And it may not be better, but it also may not be worse.
Yeah.
So being open and receptive to that, I think is really key in any role where, you're curating an experience or booking talent. You have to be receptive and open to receive criticism or new ideas.
Yep.
And, otherwise you will not stay relevant very long. And, you might have a big following, but you probably won't grow past a certain threshold because you're so, cookie cuttered or in this box, and break out of the sandbox.
Exactly.
So.
No, I mean, and then that was one of the reasons I wanted to have you in here, just to, I think, put a face with Insomniac, for a variety of reasons, right? I just think it's super important, especially when the region is being represented by somebody like yourself and, given some background, some history, and
for sure.
And I think your vision, right? Of what, I mean, I guess that would be let's do that as like kind of the final question for the Pacific Northwest. Like, do you have your own kind of mission vision for what's going to happen here? I'd love to hear that.
I mean, obviously we have some established events, we have Beyond, Boo, Day Trip, all of our big, pinnacle festival events. Those are obviously going to continue. We're going to continue to try to hone and, improve those, foster new audiences, etc. But something that I'd really like to focus on where, I've been in my role, now for about 3 years. And, we went in not really having any venues or things that we partnered with in this market outside of, a couple of the big things like WAMU and the Gorge and stuff like that.
Right.
And so now that I've been able to work with some venues and negotiate some allies in the scene here, and we've got our festivals and some of our concert business utilizing Victory Hall as our venue, which is kind of like our showbox as far as comparative wise. Now that we have that business established, I can start focusing on like the things that aren't making a bunch of money, the things that are more nuanced, the things that are more localized, because that's really what I would like to create a culture behind the brand. We have our brand, like Day Trip has a culture and it has a look and a feel, but I would love to have, small little pop-up events, small locals only events, that aren't driven by headliner talent, that, maybe we turn this random space, top to bottom into a jungle, and people come into this big immersive environment. And that's what really is my passion in, creating those experiences. Obviously music is a big part of that, but also the art, the lighting, the whole environment. And that's truly, I think outside of music itself, my biggest passion is like designing a stage or designing a party and like watching it all come to fruition. And like, you can sit back and just have that kind of proud moment of, we did this, and it's like the team came through, we took it from paper to reality. And, I'm very fortunate to work for Insomniac and have the magnitude of that company behind me. We can make a lot of really impossible things happen. And, but some of the things that get overlooked at times are some of the very small, microcosms of what really drives the scene. You look at take all the bridge events right now that are happening where there's a lot of controversy over those, of should they happen, should they not, they're renegades, but that's the culture. That's where your new DJs are coming. That's where your new producers are going. That's where people are experiencing electronic music for the first time at, and it's figuring out how to create those cool little opportunities that obviously we want to feed the festivals, and everything else, but creating those just little subcultures and cool environments. So, all the coffee shop this last weekend, I went to Pasha Collective up in Green Lake. I hadn't been there before. Everybody had been telling me to come out, and I went out, and Sloan and Amp were playing, and it was great. And I was like, dude, there's no lights. It's not a club environment. It's the middle of the day.
Have a nice espresso.
I was gonna say, there's people drinking coffee. There's people drinking
cool.
rosé.
Kids around,
it's this whole inviting, environment to. I saw people there. There's this woman that had a watermelon, and me and Emily, my partner, we were like, you come here with water. She's like, oh no. It's like at the store, and I just walking down the block, people doing their Whole Foods. People doing their errands, again, though, that would never have been exposed to this, that are like, oh, I'm coming back, I'm going to bring my husband, or I'm going to do things. And so really just stoking the culture and just do cool stuff. I mean, that's at the end of the day, like, again, we all got to make money. We have to have a living. Company has to survive. Business is business, but that's not what's driving me. It's, I want to do cool experiences. I want to do cool stuff. And so I really want to focus on in the next, coming year, and, really focusing on a lot of the smaller aspects of the art of the market. I really want to build, right now I'm still the only person in PNW, but I really want to get to a point where, we can have at least from marketing and certain aspects, like more local people involved. I'm fortunate to have all of the teams behind me that I can kind of guide and direct on them understanding Seattle and how it works. But, at the end of the day, we are vastly different than LA. We're vastly different than Chicago, than Miami, or any other market. And so, having someone that isn't from here try to understand and present stuff for that, sometimes it works, sometimes it falls a little flat. And so really try to just bolster the local aspect of Insomniac more is my primary kind of focus personally. I even did that we have some amazing production people that we work with that are, full-time with the company. But I try to hire locally as many services as we can, whether it's event producers or, back of house staff, AR, whatever the role may be in our festivals, transportation, you name it. And I really want to plug in local people to that because, it's a smaller industry up here in Seattle. And those people not only need that work or need those lighting and sound rentals to, put food on their table every night, but also who better to understand and care about the final product or the outcome or, how good it actually sounds if you're the sound engineer than people that are from here and that also want to see their local scene that they've tried to feed and help, contribite to grow and, be involved in it. And, it gives that sense of ownership. It gives that sense of pride. And it's something you just don't find as often with outside contractors or organizations. And I think, again, all full circle back to what we were originally talking about Insomniac being this big kind of looked at as a corporate, entity.
Yeah.
I really want to try to bring as much localized, heart and soul and authenticity to Seattle using all of the great power and resources that we have as Insomniac, but really micronizing that into a localized, brand. And so that's, again, very long-winded answer, but my biggest mission internally, is I want to tie in more locals. I want to have more small shows. I want to get more people involved. We all started, I say I was 12 carrying around monitors, for free. Hey, let me please help you. There's so many people that are just begging to try to be involved in this and contribute to the industry. And, I'm with the people on my team that want to be there, that aren't there just to pay their bills or, they're complaining and walk off the clock at 5, nah, man, let's stay up till 5 in the morning and figure this out. Let's rewire the whole lights. Who cares if it's not our job? Let's make it work. Let's, be invested in what we're doing and enjoy it. And, just have that pride and ownership. And so that's the biggest thing going forward that I'd really like to see, is just all the small little things that,
That's good to hear. I mean, I didn't have any real preconceived notions bringing you in here. But that's the right answer to me. You know what I mean? Like,
I appreciate that.
That's what I want to like, and I think that's probably the right answer for the region, for like the local crews and everybody, the artists. I mean, that's so cool. That's good to hear that you're thinking that way and that you're steering that direction.
We were all, on the other side of that text message or phone call to, someone that was in my role or, something like it. And it's like, I don't know how many times I got left on red or didn't get a call back. And so, as much as my bandwidth is insane and my phone, is
I know.
the most useful tool, but also the bane of my existence in life because I never turn off, so it's constantly going. But, I can choose a different job.
Yeah.
Like if I'm not being receptive, if I'm not caring about these people, then, that I'm just another fake guy that's out here for a money grab, and that's the last thing that I want to be known as. I've always tried to uphold a good reputation and, being democratic and political and understanding, of everybody's walks or opinions. And, I want to maintain that even in a larger scope, that I have now. And so definitely doing my best, to try to keep things as Seattle as we can keep them.
Well, I think you're in a good spot, and I think Insomniac's in a good spot to do that with you. And I think that can lead us right into the last thing, which is you're actually going to throw down a little DJ set.
I am
as well.
We'll see. We'll see. We're going to play.
We'll see what happens.
I don't. Don't play anything too often anymore, and like as we mentioned. But happy to come in and throw some tracks. I got a bunch of house stuff that I think I'll play, and who knows, it may end up all over the map. I don't know.
That's perfect, man. That's what I like. I tell everybody, like, there's no door, there's no like bar sales, there's no cover, there's no like, play what you want to play and enjoy it. Sounds really good in here. You'll appreciate it. Yeah. So, well, man, thanks for coming through.
Greatly appreciate it, Phil. Thanks for having me, and it's great to be able to shed some insight on,
for sure,
at least my personal mentality and the ethos, going into this. And anybody that watches this, I mean, hit me up on Facebook, hit me up on Instagram. I'll happily respond. It's like, oh man, 500 notifications.
Nice.
Must be Tuesday.
Exactly. Well, cool, man. Let's get you on the decks. Thanks
great.
so much, man.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.